The morning my stepmother sold me for $70, I was standing behind the counter of my father's locksmith shop with grease still under my thumbnail. The man in the dark gray suit had been inside less than 4 minutes. Denise smiled the way she only smiled at strangers, folded the 320s and 110 into her palm, and told him, loud enough that the bell over the door was still shivering, that Ivy would do whatever work he wanted for the rest of the day. She said it like she was closing out a receipt. She said my name the way you say the name of a tool you have owned so long you forget it can cut you back. I did not look up right away. I had learned, in the 14 months since my father died, that looking up at Denise in front of a customer was the same as agreeing with her. So I kept my eyes on the cylinder and waited to see what a stranger believed he had bought. Denise had been doing this in smaller ways for a year. She would sell the tail end of my father's oil stock to a hardware man for cash. She would let a customer's payment sit in her purse for a week before it reached the drawer. She had never, until that morning, put a price on my hands in front of another human being. She was watching me now from the far side of the counter to see whether I understood the shape my life would take. The stranger did not answer her. He walked past the little swinging gate that separated the counter from the workbench, and he stopped in front of me, and he laid the $70 on the wood between us in 3 neat folded pieces. He said in a voice that was quiet in a way that only very dangerous voices are quiet, "I did not buy you. I paid for your decision. What you do with it is yours." Then he waited, and in that small, terrible pause, I understood 2 things at once. The first was that this man was not what he looked like. The second was that whatever he had actually come here for, my father was somehow already inside it. If you have ever felt a room turn from ordinary to unfamiliar in the space of one breath, stay with me, because what happened next is the reason I am telling this story. My name is Ivy Calder. I am 37 years old. My father, Thomas Calder, was a locksmith in Savannah, Georgia for 41 years, and I worked at his elbow for the last 15 of them. I know the sound a good pin makes when it seats. I know the weight of a properly cut brass blank in the palm. I know my father's hand finishing the way some daughters know their father's handwriting, by shape and by pressure, and by the small habits nobody else would think to notice. And I knew, standing at that counter with $70 in front of me, that whatever this stranger had come to say, it was going to force me to test every one of those things I thought I knew. Denise cleared her throat behind me. She still had one of the 20s pinched between 2 fingers. "Ivy," she said, with the small warning laugh she used in front of company, "the gentleman paid. Go on." She had married my father 8 years before he died. She had never once picked up a file or a pick or a torque wrench, but she held the lease on the shop, the accounts, and the little brick house on East Bay where I still slept in the room I had slept in as a girl. She held out her hand for the 10, and she waited for me to obey the shape of the morning she had just arranged. I did not take the 10. I looked at the stranger instead. He was not young. He was maybe 55 or 56, with iron in his hair, and a stillness around the eyes that reminded me of the way certain locks look before you begin, the ones that appear simple and are not. I asked him what work he wanted. He said he wanted me to look at a broken lock. He said he would drive. Denise stepped closer to the counter then, still holding her 20s, and she opened her mouth as though to correct the tilt of the room. I turned my head just once and looked at her the way I had never looked at her in 8 years. She did not finish her sentence. She set the 20s down on the counter very carefully, as though they had grown warm in her hand, and she stepped back from us both. He said if I wanted to stay, I could stay, and he would leave, and I would still keep the $70 because he had not paid for a lock, he had paid for the answer to a question, and my answer was mine to give. Denise's mouth pulled tight around the dry sound she made when a plan of hers stopped moving. I picked up the money, folded it once, and told her I was going. The car outside was black and quiet in the way expensive cars are quiet, and it did not smell of anything at all. He drove east toward the river, and after about 6 blocks he told me his name. He said it the way someone tells you the door is about to open. Salvatore Bellini. I felt the seat under me go a little colder. In Savannah, if you have lived here long enough, you know the name Bellini the way you know which streets flood in a storm. You do not say it loudly. You do not say it to strangers. My father had done legitimate lock work for one of the Bellini shipping companies years ago, small jobs on office suites. And he had come home from those jobs quieter than usual, and I had never asked why. I understood now why I had never asked. Some questions live better with the answers still folded up inside them. I asked him what the lock was. He said it was the door of a bonded warehouse at the Savannah port. He said it had been opened 3 nights earlier, without force, without damage, without alarm, and the only thing left behind inside the cylinder was a duplicate key. He said the duplicate carried a mark on the bow. He said the mark was a small, stylized C inside a diamond. I felt the $70 in my coat pocket the way you feel a stone in your shoe. That mark was my father's stamp. He had punched it into every key he cut for 4 decades. And my father had been dead 14 months. If the opening moved you even a little, tap that like button and follow along, because the truth of who bought me for $70 is far worse and far stranger than anything Denise thought she was selling. We drove the rest of the way without speaking. I watched the marsh grass slide past the window, and I tried to hold in my head all the shapes the truth could take. Either my father, in the last months of his life, had cut a key that opened a Mafia warehouse for someone he should not have been cutting for, or somebody with enough patience and skill had built a copy of his work good enough to fool the people who paid attention to such things. When we reached the port, the sky had that flat pewter color Savannah gets in late morning, and the air smelled of diesel and river mud and rope. 3 long steel warehouses ran along the pier like a row of shut mouths. A gull cried once and did not cry again. I could feel the $70 in my pocket the whole walk from the car to the door, and I understood, at last, that money had never once bought a decision I could not still take back. I did not yet know which possibility scared me more. I only knew that I could not let a stranger, even one who had returned my choice to me, decide the answer without me in the room. At the warehouse, 2 men in dark coats stepped aside when Salvatore nodded, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them looked at me. I asked for the cylinder. A younger man carried it over on a clean cloth, the way you carry an injured bird. I set the cylinder on the folding table under the work light and put my loupe to my eye. The pins were not sheared. The driver springs were intact. There were no scratches around the keyway that a pick would have left. The lock had simply been opened. And there, on the bow of the recovered duplicate, was the stylized C inside its little diamond, punched crisp and clean, exactly the depth my father had always used on his old hand press. I turned the key under the light. The finishing on the shoulder was rounded in a small, particular way. My father used to slide the shoulder against a fine wheel for 2 seconds, always 2 seconds, never 3. Because the 3rd second, he said, made the key look factory, and a real locksmith's key should look like something a person made. This shoulder had been finished for 2 seconds. I set the key down carefully, the way you set down evidence. I told Salvatore Bellini that the stamp was real. I told him the finishing was real. I told him I did not yet know what that meant, and I would not lie to protect a man who could no longer answer for himself. He looked at me for a long moment, weighing me the way I had just weighed the key, and then he said, "Then help me find out who put that key in that door." He did not say please. He did not say it as an order. He said it the way you say something you already know the other person is going to accept, because the choice has already been made inside them. I said yes. Not for him, for my father. Because the only thing worse than discovering Thomas Calder had betrayed a client in his last months of life would be letting him be buried a second time by a story that was not even true. and I would rather learn the worst about my father myself than hear it from a stranger's mouth. We drove back to the shop that afternoon, and Salvatore Bellini walked into Calder Locksmith not as a customer and not as a boss, but as a man following the person who knew more than he did about the object that was ruining his week. Denise was still at the counter. She saw him with me, and her face did a small, ugly thing, and then smoothed itself. She started to speak. He did not let her. He asked her, politely, if she would give us the shop for an hour. She looked at the $70 she had already put in the register, and she understood, in a way she did not have the vocabulary for, that the transaction she thought she had gone somewhere she could not follow. She left. The bell over the door rang behind her, and for the first time in 14 months, I stood inside my father's shop without her voice in it. I opened my father's service ledger, 41 years of jobs, written in his small, level handwriting, one line per job, the way he had taught me. I ran my finger down the columns, and near the back, in the last 2 years of entries, I found the first wound. 6 pages had been cut out. Not torn, cut, cleanly, with a straight blade, close enough to the spine that a casual glance would have missed the loss. I felt something behind my ribs go very still. I went to the drawer where my father kept his specialty blanks, the odd profiles he stocked for the older commercial locks around the port. 3 of the trays were short, not empty, short. Enough missing that no inventory would flag it, enough that any working locksmith could see the shape of the theft, the way you see a missing tooth in a mouth. I did not tell Salvatore any of that yet. I sat down at the bench and I picked up the recovered duplicate again, and I put the loop back to my eye, and this time I did not look at the outside. I looked into the keyway of the breached cylinder itself. And there, on the inside wall of the 3rd chamber, so small I almost passed over it, was a faint crescent-shaped scratch, no wider than a human hair. A scratch like that does not happen by accident. Brass is soft, but a lock cylinder is protected. Nothing inside a keyway should ever mark that wall except a piece of steel held at a very specific angle, and no working locksmith would leave such a mark by clumsiness. I sat with my hands flat on the bench for a long minute. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about the way he used to hold a file at an angle nobody else had ever taught him. I froze. I had seen that scratch before. I could not remember where, but I knew, in the way your hands know a lock before your mouth can name it, that my father's fingerprints were somewhere on that mark, and I had to remember where before someone else built a story around it that I could not undo. That night I could not sleep. I sat on the floor of the shop with my father's old practice cylinders spread around me in a loose circle. They were the ones he used to teach on, the ones he kept in the wooden crate under the bench because he could not throw anything mechanical away. If you have ever loved someone gone and gone through their tools trying to hear their voice, you are the kind of viewer this story is for. I turned each cylinder over slowly under the work lamp. I did not find the crescent that night. I found something else. In 3 of the cylinders, tucked in with the practice work, were pins my father had filed by hand into shapes that did not belong in any commercial lock I recognized. Odd, subtle shapes, filed at the shoulder to seat on the first turn but bind on the second. He had been building something. He had not told me what, and he had died before he had the chance. The next morning, Salvatore was at the counter at 8. He did not bring men. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee from a place 2 streets over, and set one in front of me without asking how I took it, which annoyed me only until I tasted it and realized he had guessed correctly. He asked what I needed. I told him I needed access to any old jobs my father had done for Bellini properties, and every contractor who had been near those warehouses in 5 years. I told him I needed him to understand that I would not be moved off the bench by anyone in a dark coat, including him. He said, agreed. That was the first time I saw the corner of his mouth move in something like a smile. We worked. For 11 days we worked, mornings at the shop, afternoons at the port, comparing my father's old service tickets against the properties that had been breached and the properties that had almost been breached. On the fourth day, he ruined the left sleeve of a suit that probably cost more than my rent for 6 months, catching it on my father's old cutting machine. He looked down at the tear and up at me and said, "Do not tell anyone about this." I laughed before I could stop myself. He did not look away. He looked pleased, actually, like a man who had not been laughed at in a long time and had forgotten it was allowed. On the 6th day, I handed him a small practice lock, the kind my father used to give to children who came into the shop, and I told him to open it. He worked at it for 19 minutes. He did not open it. One of his men, standing by the door, started to say, "Mr. Bellini did not need to know how to pick locks," and Salvatore, without turning his head, said, "Ivy is the expert in this room. When she is teaching me, you are quiet." The man went quiet. I kept my eyes on the bench because if I had looked up right then, I would have shown him something on my face I was not ready to show him yet. On the 8th day, another Bellini facility, a smaller records office 2 piers down from the first warehouse, showed signs of an attempted entry. No damage, no alarm. But the cleaning crew found a scuff on the strike plate that should not have been there. Salvatore's people found, in a drainage grate outside the building, a broken piece of brass blank of a very particular profile. My profile. My father's profile. Salvatore came into the shop that afternoon with the piece in a small envelope, set it on the bench, and said, "I want to shut it down tonight. Every contractor on the port, every person who has held one of your father's keys, off my properties by morning." His voice was still quiet, quieter than the first morning, actually. That was how I knew he meant it. I said no. I said if he shut it down tonight, the person using my father's stamp would vanish. The story of Thomas Calder, the crooked locksmith, would harden into fact, and I would spend the rest of my life carrying a name I could not clean. I asked for 1 more week. He looked at me for a long time. I could see him weighing the cost of trusting me against the cost of losing another warehouse. Underneath that, I could see something I was not sure he had shown anyone in a long time. The fact that he did not want to be the man who took the choice away from me. He said, 1 week. He said it like a man setting down something heavy. Then he left, quietly. That night I finally remembered where I had seen the crescent scratch. It was in a cylinder my father had marked with a small red X on the base, one of the ones I had spread around me on the floor 2 nights before. I dug it out of the crate. I put the loop to it. Inside the 3rd chamber, on the inside wall, a faint crescent scratch, no wider than a human hair. I sat back on my heels on the shop floor and I stared at it. I pulled out 2 more of his red X cylinders. Same scratch, same chamber, same size. I understood then, in one clean piece, what my father had been doing in the last months of his life. When he had suspected a customer of requesting an unauthorized duplicate, he had not refused. He had made the duplicate. But he had cut it with a tiny, deliberate flaw. A scratch inside the 3rd chamber, a mark only another locksmith would notice, and only after the key had been used. He had been building a warning signature. He had been laying a trail. He had not been supplying thieves. He had been marking them. He had built a language nobody knew he was speaking, and died with the dictionary still open on his bench. I called Salvatore at 2:30 in the morning. He answered on the 2nd ring, wide awake, which told me something else about him. I told him what my father had done. I told him the crescent was not evidence of Thomas Calder's guilt. I told him it was evidence of his refusal. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Then he was better than his reputation." I told him that was not a compliment I was ready to accept yet, and he laughed, a low, real laugh, the first honest sound I had heard him make. But that still did not answer the harder question. The stamp was real. The blanks were real. Somebody living had walked into my father's shop with his tools. And I already knew in the back of my mind that I had been sharing a house with the answer for 8 years. The next morning I told Denise I needed to talk with her, in the kitchen, without the television on. She sat down with the polite face she used when she thought a conversation would be about money. I asked her when she had first sold anything from the shop. She said a few obsolete pieces after my father died, an old vise, some tools nobody used. She said it the way she said everything, with a little laugh at the end, as though the laugh were a period. I asked her to whom. She said she did not remember. I asked her if the name was Sloane. Her hand moved just once toward the coffee cup and stopped. That was all I needed. I sat down across from her. I told her I already knew about the ledger pages, the blanks, the stamp. I told her a locksmith's stamp does not travel by accident, and my father's had traveled all the way into a Mafia warehouse. I asked her one question. I asked her if the $70 had been Sloane's idea. Her face did something I will not forget as long as I live. It did not go pale. It went smooth, the way a lake goes smooth right before a storm. She said very quietly, "He said he needed you out of the shop for the day. Whoever came in first, I should send you off with. He did not tell me it would be Bellini." She looked up. I did not know it would be Bellini, as though that changed what she had done, as though the crime were only in the identity of the buyer, not the fact of the sale, as though selling my mourning to a good stranger would have been forgivable, and only selling it to a dangerous one had turned out to be a mistake she needed to explain. I stood up. I told her that starting that afternoon, she was no longer allowed inside the shop. I told her I would be changing every lock she had a key to by the end of the week, which, I said, was one thing I happened to know how to do. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I had learned that from a man who had returned $70 to my hand 10 days earlier and never once raised his own. Denise sat there at the kitchen table for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, and I watched her count, in her head, the number of things she had already sold and the number of doors she had left. She started to speak. I did not let her. I took the shop key off her ring myself, right there in front of her, and I put it in my coat pocket beside the $70 I had never once spent. Martin Sloane, I learned that afternoon from Salvatore's people, was a port maintenance contractor in his late 40s. He had worked in and around the Savannah docks for 20 years. He had legitimate keys to a dozen buildings and legitimate reasons to walk past 100 more. He had 5 years earlier approached my father asking for a set of unrestricted duplicates for a client audit that had never existed. My father had refused him, quietly, and had cut, I now knew, the first flawed decoy in response. Salvatore also showed me a photograph of Sloane from a port security file. He was a wide, plain man with a face no jury would remember, and eyes that had learned young how not to be looked at twice. My father had recognized that face 5 years before I ever saw it. He had gone home and quietly cut a piece of brass in the shape of a warning, and had said nothing to me because he did not want me carrying the weight of it while he lived. That decoy was one of the cylinders in the crate under my bench, the one with the reddest X, worn from being turned over in his hands. Sloane had waited. He had watched my father get old. He had waited until my father was in the ground, and then he had walked into Denise's kitchen with cash, and he had begun buying, piece by piece, the shop I had thought was still mine. He had bought her for less than the shop was worth. I did not want Salvatore to solve this the old way. I had seen enough of the old way to know what it left behind. The small news stories about men who disappeared from their trucks. The widow interviews where nobody said the word Bellini and everybody meant it. I wanted Sloane to walk into the trap my father had been building for 5 years and never got to spring. So I sat with Salvatore at the workbench and drew, on butcher paper, the shape of the trap. We would let Sloane believe one final Calder master pattern had slipped past Salvatore's review. We would send it through the same channel Denise had used, one of Sloane's low men who did not yet know his boss was already burning. We would cut the key on my father's blanks, with my father's stamp, with my father's finishing, and I would set a crescent inside the third chamber, so small Sloane would never see it. I would let his crew get through the outer door of a warehouse Salvatore had already emptied. At the inner mechanism, the one my father had really been protecting, The flaw would bind exactly the way my father had designed it to bind 5 years ago. And Sloane's people would be standing in an empty room with a dead key when the Port Authority arrived. Salvatore listened to the whole plan without interrupting me once, which was itself a kind of gift. When I finished, he said, "And where are you during this?" I said, "At the bench, where I always am." He did not like that. I could see him not liking it in the small muscle at the hinge of his jaw. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "All right." That was the second real trust between us, because he was letting me stand where he could not stand between me and the danger. If you have made it this far with me, tell me in the comments what you would have done in that kitchen with Denise, because I still, months later, wonder if I was too easy on her or not easy enough. We set the trap on a Thursday. Salvatore emptied the Target warehouse of everything of value on Tuesday night, quietly. So quietly that Sloane's watchers, if any were watching, would see nothing move. On Wednesday afternoon, one of Sloane's low men, a man named Petey who ran errands and did not ask questions, came in with cash and a story about a client who needed a duplicate from an old Bellini pattern. I cut the key while he watched. I stamped it on my father's old hand press, the same way he had stamped 10,000 keys before it. I finished the shoulder for 2 seconds, not 3. I set the crescent inside the third chamber with a tool no bigger than a dental pick, holding my breath the way my father had taught me to hold it before a pin fell. I handed the key across the counter. Petey paid me in cash, in old bills, one of which I later learned had come out of Denise's kitchen drawer. He left whistling, the kind of detail that tells you a man does not know he is already caught. Thursday night I sat in the shop with the lights off and my father's oldest wall clock ticking against the far wall, and Salvatore sat across from me at the bench, and neither of us said much. At 11:41, a call came through on his phone. Sloane's crew had entered the warehouse. The outer door had opened cleanly. They were inside. At 11:53, a second call. The inner mechanism had bound. They were trying it again. At 11:58, a third call. Port Authority had converged, quietly, from 3 directions, and Sloane's people had walked out of the warehouse in handcuffs and into a set of unmarked vehicles that did not belong to Salvatore. Sloane himself was picked up 2 blocks from the pier, in a truck he did not own, with a duplicate of my key in his coat pocket, still warm. 17 minutes from first call to last. Salvatore closed his phone. He looked at me across the bench. He did not smile. He said, "Your father would have liked you tonight." I could not answer him for a moment. I had spent 14 months trying not to cry in front of Denise, and I found I could still cry in front of a man who had once handed me $70 and told me the decision was mine. I did not sob. I just let the tears go, and he did not look away. The days that followed were slower than I expected. Sloane's arrest turned into a longer federal case, and the recovered materials, the blanks, the stamp, the ledger pages Sloane's people had tried to burn and only half succeeded, all of it came out in a stack of reports that made 3 things clear at once. Thomas Calder had refused Sloane 5 years earlier. Thomas Calder had built a hidden defense. Denise had, over 14 months, sold Sloane every piece of that defense. Denise was arrested on a Wednesday morning at the little brick house on East Bay. She did not look at me when they walked her out. I did not look away. Salvatore did not send anyone after her. He did not need to. He simply withdrew the quiet financial cushion Sloane had been paying her under a false consulting arrangement, and the law did the rest, which was, I understood later, the most restrained form of vengeance a man like him had ever practiced. Her lawyer called me twice in the following weeks. The first time, he asked whether I would submit a statement of family character. I told him I had no character left to give her. The second time, he asked whether I intended to visit her at the county facility before her arraignment. I told him no. I did not say it cruelly. I said it the way you close a door on a room you have finally finished cleaning. She had made her sale. I had made mine. He did it, I think, because I had asked him to. He also did it, I think, because he had learned somewhere in the middle of those 11 days that there were things I would not stay for, and he had decided he wanted me to stay. I reopened Calder Locksmith 6 weeks later, under my own name on the business license, with my father's name still on the sign above the door, and my own name added underneath it in smaller letters. I did not take $1 from Salvatore to do it. The publicity around the case had brought legitimate customers back to the door, people who remembered my father and wanted to see for themselves that the shop was in honest hands again. I hired one apprentice, a quiet young woman named Rhea, who had grown up 2 streets over and had the same slow, careful hands my father had trained mine to be. I threw away Denise's old register drawer and bought a new one. On the first morning, I opened the door with my own key. I stood inside the empty shop a long minute before I flipped the sign. I put my father's stamp back on its hook. I laid a fresh notebook on the counter and wrote my first line in my own handwriting, not his. A woman came in at 8:30 with a broken office lock and did not know any of what had happened. She only knew the shop was open again. She paid full price. She thanked me. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week after the reopening, the bell over the door rang, and Salvatore Bellini walked into my shop alone, carrying a brass padlock with a bent shackle, the kind any customer might bring in on any afternoon. He did not walk past the swinging gate. He took a paper number from the little dispenser by the door, sat in one of the 2 chairs against the wall, and waited his turn like anyone else. When his number came up, I called it. He walked to the counter. I quoted him full price for the repair, $38, the same price I would have quoted anyone. He paid it in cash, and he waited while I wrote him a receipt in my father's small, level handwriting, which I had taught myself to imitate for exactly this reason, so his name would still be on the paper every customer took home. Only when the receipt was in his hand did he look up and ask, very quietly, if I would have dinner with him on Friday. He did not say where. He did not say how long. He did not put anything else on the counter between us. He simply asked. I looked at him for what felt like a long time. This man who had once been the most feared name in the port and had learned, in 11 days at my father's workbench, how to take a number. I told him yes, 1 dinner, and he was paying at full price. He laughed, the same low, real laugh from the night on the phone, and said, I would not have insulted you by offering less. He left. The bell over the door rang once, softly, and settled. I stood at the counter with the $38 in the drawer and the receipt copy on the spike, and my father's stamp back on its hook. I thought about the morning 9 weeks earlier when Denise had folded $70 into her palm and told a stranger I would do whatever work he wanted. I thought about how sure she had been that $70 was a weapon. I thought about how wrong she had been about which of us it would cut. I thought about my father, the years he had spent building a defense he never got to spring, and how strange it was that his last customer turned out to be his daughter. If this story reached you tonight, if you sat with me through the $70 and the crescent scratch, and the 11 days at the bench, and the moment my father's trap finally closed on the man who thought he had bought his tools, tap that like and follow along, because the next story I have is about the letter Sloane wrote from his cell, and the one line about my father I cannot stop reading. My name is Ivy Calder. My father was Thomas Calder. The shop is mine now, in my name and under my hand, with his stamp on the hook and his handwriting on the receipts, and his crescent inside 3 cylinders I keep in a drawer nobody else opens. And nobody, not a stepmother with a folded 20 in her hand, not a man at the port, not anyone who walks through that door, decides what my time costs anymore, except me.